Welcome everyone to the first ever Tid-Bits in history. I'm your host, Garrett Backus, and today we'll be going over one of my favorite topics in history, and something that has to do a lot with protest history in the United States, the Industrial Revolution, and more notably, the workers' protests from that age. The post-Reconstruction United States was a blooming time for industry, with the New South being rebuilt upon the smoldering ashes of the Confederacy. And with the continuation of steam power, as well as the advent of electricity, factories could move much closer to cities, and thus their workforce majorities. This, however, mixed with the issues of the United States government's laissez-faire economic system. This led to the U.S. being one of the leading countries in the industrial and economic world, but it also led to a great deal of trampling of workers' rights and the overgrowth of the industrial sectors of the economy. One of the biggest industries of the time was the railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, but during its construction, Chinese and other immigrant workers often struck or rioted due to the pay difference. Chinese especially were paid far less than white workers, but made up 80% of the Central Pacific Company, leading to a major strike in 1867. The Central Pacific was one of the two companies building the line. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific merged when the railroad was completed. With the expansion of industry and the trampling of rights, many new organizations were created to fight against the injustice of big business. One of the many was the IWW, or Industrial Workers of the World. They created numerous posters for recruitment and to push for many different reforms to labor. But there was one individual that hit the industrial world hard, besides this mad lad. President Roosevelt put a boot to a lot of trusts by lawsuits and fighting for legislation for workers' rights, as well as antitrust and anti-monopoly suits. His favorite weapon was the Sherman Antitrust Act, using it to break up or forcibly stop companies from merging if it would harm business or other competitors. But one individual made a fight he didn't even need to fight for. Upton Sinclair, a so-called muckraker, was a type of social activist and novelist who used his writings to fight against the trusts and monopolies, as well as fight for the average American worker. His most iconic work was The Jungle, which showed the appalling conditions of the Chicago meat industry. But he wanted to focus on improving the working conditions and pay. While Sinclair wanted to fight for workers' rights and socialisms, most of the United States focused on what they cared about: food. And thus, Sinclair made his comment, "I aimed for the heart and hit the stomach." Roosevelt actually did not trust Sinclair due to his socialist leanings, as he distrusted socialism and socialists. However, while Sinclair had been more focused on workers in the factories and the terrible practices of businesses, he got the people, both citizens and foreigners, government, and most importantly, eventually President Roosevelt, into a panic and frenzy about meatpacking conditions, for the food as well as the workers. Roosevelt sent out many inspections to the plants, and what the inspectors found, even after cleanups from plant owners, was this. For reference, this is a picture similar, if not the same, as what Sinclair would have seen in Chicago. Blood-stained walls, meat laying around on unclean surfaces. There were even stories of workers losing fingers and cutting themselves, or burning themselves on acid. Meat was often cleaned or preserved in dangerous chemicals like formaldehyde. And lastly, meats were often heavily mislabeled. Sometimes raw meat would be scraped up off the floor and thrown into sausages, which often included the injured worker's blood. This disgusting revelation led Roosevelt and Congress to pass the Safe Food and Drug Act, strengthening the already known Bureau of Chemistry, or what you all know today as the FDA, or Food and Drug Administration. On top of this, they passed the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906 to further delve into the meat industry. The focus on food safety in meat plants often affected the workers in a beneficial way as well, as they had to use much less dangerous preservatives and were much cleaner environments, making the risk of disease far less and the safety from acid burns and other chemicals much more in depth. Though many of the works of protest from the Industrial Revolution and many social reforms did come around, not many hit the US as hard as the jungle did in its day. It flooded readers with disgust and showed off the reality of an industry that affected everyone on a day-to-day basis. So, with that, I want to thank you all for watching the Tidbits in History. And as my hat says, don't make history repeat itself. It's not a fun time. Thank you.